The Netherlands was at war with their lord Felipe II, the King of Spain, and with each other. The Roman Catholic king had tried to establish absolute rule, mercilessly persecuted Protestants in the country, and burned them on the stake as heretics. When several Dutch states rebelled against the king's measures, he sent the Grand Duke of Alba over with a large army to sort out the rebels. He declared martial law and convicted many nobles believed to be responsible for the revolt against the king. The de facto leader of the rebellion, Prince Willem of Orange, was also tried and convicted while he was out of the country. His son and heir had been abducted and sent to Spain. His properties were confiscated and many of his friends were executed. Willem eventually declared war on Alba and made several attempts to invade the country and kick out the foreign troops. There was a great division in the country between the rebel and mostly Calvinist northern and the loyal, mostly Roman Catholic southern states. But 10 years in, the Spanish soldiers, the infamous tercios among them, hadn't been paid their salaries by the king. They mutinied and mercilessly plundered the country. As a result, all states united against the Spaniards in the so-called Pacification of Ghent, all states except Luxembourg. The king's brother, Don Juan, had been made governor-general but suddenly passed away, and Felipe put his nephew, Prince Alessandro Farnese, the future Duke of Parma and Piacenza, in charge. He was working his magic on getting the people and the states to return to the king and destroy the unity. He was quite successful. The governor-general for the king was currently in the middle of the siege of Maastricht. Alessandro Farnese's siege in Maastricht ran into financial troubles. The governor-general and his officers sold everything they could, jewelry, golden chains, anything to fund the troops, so they wouldn't desert him. Even his own silver plateware ended up on the auction block. On June 28, 1579, the royal army took the Ravelin at the Brussels Gate that the citizens had dubbed Fort Parma. 1,000 defenders died during the assault, and the last 400 remaining garrison troops retreated to their last standing fortifications. All were wounded and wanted to surrender, but the citizens told them that they would kill them first. So, together they built another fort inside the Brussels Gate. Farnese threw a pontoon bridge across, right in the firing line of the new structure. He picked up an axe and a hammer and led the way, calmly driving the first piles for the bridge himself like a common pioneer. He remained miraculously unharmed, while officers and soldiers fell dead around him. Gilles de Berlaymont, Lord of Hierges, was one of them. Alessandro stayed until he finished the bridge and put 10 cannons on it. The Spanish then let loose the cannons and triggered their previously dug mines, blowing part of the defensive structure into the air. After a fierce hand-to-hand combat, the defenders retreated behind their very last defensive wall and prepared to make their last stand. But by now, Farnese was sick as a dog, a fate seemingly reserved for all the king's governor-generals. He called it a day and went to bed. He sent out a herald to applaud the besieged for their bravery, but begged them to surrender. The defenders said no, and fortified their last defense. From his sickbed, Farnese ordered his men to take the final obstacle. It should be easy compared to the ones they'd already taken. The next day was the festival of St. Peter and St. Paul. A nice day for a victory. That night, a Spanish soldier discovered a crack in the city wall, made it bigger, crawled through, and had a look-see about town. Everyone was asleep, and he returned to the camp to tell the general all about it. Alessandro, unable to get out of bed, ordered a surprise attack before dawn. The citizens were indeed asleep and unable to fight off the invaders. Although Farnese had expressly forbidden his men to plunder and murder, it was a massacre. Women were targeted in particular. They'd acted like men in the defense of the town. They were pursued from house to house and thrown from roofs and windows. They were hunted into the river and torn limb from limb in the streets. Men and children fared no better. 4,000 men and women were slaughtered on the first day. The massacre lasted 2 more days. It was said that no more than 400 citizens were left alive. Maastricht was not only captured, it was depopulated. The plunder was grand. Maastricht had been a wealthy city. The Prince of Orange, as per usual, was blamed for all of it. Voices started whispering that Willem had delivered his fellow countrymen to butchery, but the prince had begged everyone to save Maastricht, but no one had cared, since it wasn't their state suffering. The tensions between Willem and the militant Calvinists increased. Farnese was very successful in creating chaos and confusion among the people of the southern Netherlands. Roman Catholic and Protestant citizens of Antwerp, Mechelen, and 's-Hertogenbosch faced off with each other, leaving city councils scrambling for solutions. Antwerp remained on the rebels' side, while Mechelen and 's-Hertogenbosch flipped to the king's side. Philips, the Count of Egmont, the 21-year-old son of the late General Egmont, turned on the prince as well. He tried to take Brussels for the Spanish. The citizens grabbed their weapons. Colonel Olivier van den Teympel, now the prince's governor of Brussels, armed his men and trapped young Egmont and his regiment on the town's main square, his father's execution site. People taunted the count and asked if he was there looking for his father's head. The colonel allowed Egmont to leave on June 5, 1579, the day of the 11th anniversary of Philip's father's execution. Young Egmont then claimed that he would never join the wicked Spaniards. Anyone who said different was a liar and a slanderer, but he told Farnese that he had decided to embrace the cause of His Majesty and the ancient religion. Egmont wanted all the rewards, and Farnese promised him the world. A few months later, young Egmont attacked Willem personally when he found out he was staying in Baasrode near Antwerp for the night. The prince narrowly escaped to his fleet that lay anchored in Antwerp harbor. 2 hours later, the malcontents burned Baasrode to the ground. Meanwhile, Farnese was dying. The Governor-General was so ill that he received the final sacraments and prepared to meet his maker. Farnese's fever rose and he became delirious. He started spouting nonsense and made imaginary battle arrays. He continued to give orders which his officers followed to the letter. What? Alessandro's orders appeared to be revelations from God. Farnese was predicting the future. Any rebellion among the troops was weirdly foreseen by the Governor-General and subsequently squashed. As a result, his officers were able to keep the army under control, while the general was out of commission. After 20 days of this, Alessandro's final hour had come. His fever was going through the roof, and physicians could do nothing for him. Suddenly, a restless Farnese jumped up on the bed, and everyone could now see a large black sore on his back. The doctors, ashamed they'd missed it, cut it away, and Farnese quickly recovered. The moment he could sit up, his 40,000 men celebrated the general's miraculous healing by parading him through Maastricht on a red velvet chair, like a Roman emperor carried into Rome after a victory. The bodies of the citizens were still rotting in the streets. After the failed Köln Conference, Willem told the States General to fire him. The Spanish would attack next year, and since no one wanted to pay for an army to stop them, there was no need for him anymore. Besides, despite all his hard work, with all the slander that had been hurled at him by evil and badly informed people, he, his house, and his family were about to be ruined. The States ignored Willem's resignation, but asked him instead what to do about Hercule François de France, the Duke of Anjou and Alençon, the brother of King Henri III of France, who had offered himself to become the sovereign of the Netherlands. Willem proposed they take him up on it, but to limit his powers and put the states in charge. They didn't know it yet, because the concept was foreign to them, but this became the basis for the Dutch constitution. A sovereign would have little power. The power belonged to the people. While the malcontents leader, Emmanuel Philibert of Lalaing, was plundering Kortrijk with his men, another Lalaing came under suspicion, George of Lalaing, the Count of Rennenberg. He was the Roman Catholic stadtholder of Groningen, Friesland, Drenthe and Overijssel. He fought on the rebels' side, but his family had always loyally served the king. Rennenberg started to worry about the reputation of his house and became increasingly upset with the arrogant Nassaus. He believed that Willem had ruined the Köln Conference with his demands. When the militant Calvinists entered his territory, took Leeuwarden and Harlingen and set their sights on Groningen, he drew the conclusion that the religious peace the prince had been preaching was a sham. The Count's sister urged him to resist the Prince of Darkness, who was clearly out to destroy their house and limit her brother's powers. He listened to her. It was odd. Under the rebels, Rennenberg had more power than the king could ever give him. Still, he reached out to the Spanish, believing that Felipe would be more generous. Carlos, the Duke of Terranova, agreed to pay Rennenberg a ton of cash and titles for his betrayal. The king also promised the Count that he could marry the widowed Countess of Megen, with whom he was in love. When Willem heard rumors that Rennenberg had been bought by Terranova, he refused to listen to such slander. He himself had been the victim of severe and incessant smears. But when Rennenberg started recruiting troops, Willem called the Count to come to him at once. When Rennenberg didn't respond, Willem decided to get the 411 himself and headed for Groningen. If the north fell into Spanish hands, the Union would be under attack from the north, the south and the east. Friesland and Groningen had to be saved at all cost. Willem told Barthold Entens to seize Groningen city the next day at 11 o'clock in the morning. But Rennenberg found out about the plan and feared the prince would enter the city with his guards. If that happened, his plan to hand over the town to the Spanish would fall apart, and he could kiss his rewards, his house, and probably his life goodbye. That night, after a lavish dinner, the Count locked up anyone who wasn't on his side. On March 3rd, 1580, at 6 o'clock in the morning, Rennenberg entered the town's market square. He announced his switch to the king's side to a baffled crowd gathered there. He told them, "Stand by me, good citizens, stand by me. Only now am I the true stadtholder of these lands. Let us finish doing what is necessary for the service of His Majesty and for our own protection." Armed citizens led by Mayor Jacob Hillebrands tried to stop him, but one of Rennenberg's men shot the mayor dead, and it was done. The crowds fled, and Rennenberg's men pursued them. Anyone who was even remotely anti-Spanish was arrested and thrown into pits. Entens was too late to take the town, but the state of Groningen was mostly Protestant and refused to switch sides with their stadtholder. Entens now laid siege on the city of Groningen, and Rennenberg begged Farnese to come and rescue him. Dietrich Sonoy, the prince's lieutenant governor for the northern quarter, managed to move quickly and preserved Friesland for the prince. Rennenberg's betrayal was the first crisis of the Union of Utrecht. In reaction, a ton of towns in the north kicked the Roman Catholics out, banned Roman Catholic services, and some even closed the churches altogether. Meanwhile, the Union of Utrecht's territory shrank steadily as Farnese moved onward and upwards with the royal army. Both sides fought a harder and harder battle, and the people, caught in the middle, suffered. In April 1580, Colonel van den Tijpel gathered a military force supported by the English mercenaries under Commander John Norris to take Mechelen back from the Spanish. After a short battle, the city was taken, but then the English soldiers plundered homes, churches, and monasteries. The English fury. Really, guys? Really? Willem begged the States General to hurry and instate Anjou as their sovereign. If they didn't, the country would go down in flames and no one would be left to help them. King Henri of France risked the fury of Felipe but promised his brother Anjou he would gather a large army to help him save the Netherlands. After much hesitation, the States finally sent negotiators Anjou's way and offered him a treaty, which promised him to become the Prince and Seigneur of the Netherlands. The war continued in a slow and unfocused way in different parts of the country. Zwolle's government and citizens were mostly Roman Catholic, but there were also important Calvinists and no one got along. One day, a fight broke out between Calvinists and Roman Catholics in the streets. The fight turned into a war. Maarten Schenk van Nijdergen, who had switched from the rebel to the Spanish side after the defeat to John Blue, was on his way to relieve Groningen and refused to come to the malcontents' aid. A strategic error. Zwolle was lost to the Roman Catholics soon after. Prince Willem sent in General Philip van Hohenlohe and his own nephew Willem Ludwig van Nassau to support the siege of Groningen. Hohenlohe had his eye on Willem's eldest daughter, Maria. Willem Lodewijk had his eye on Willem's second daughter, Anna, his cousin. While at the siege, they got word that Schenk was close to Groningen to supply the city. Hohenlohe, in his infinite wisdom, figured he could stop him and left the siege with a lot of men. The two armies clashed at the Hardenberger Heide. Hohenlohe's cannons caused the Spanish lancers to flee. The general's cavalry went in pursuit, but the Spanish surrounded them, and Hohenlohe lost 1,500 men. Schenk lost 100. Hohenlohe managed to get away, but others were murdered by local farmers who had suffered too much from the war. They were fed up. The general had been unable to stop Schenk, who now continued on his way toward Groningen. The next day, Willem Lodewijk realized he simply didn't have enough rebel troops left at the walls. The siege of Groningen was abandoned. The Count of Rennenberg was now strengthened with Schenk's troops. He moved out and took Delfzijl and other forts in rebel hands. Hohenlohe and Willem Lodewijk now headed out to take back Coevorden. At twilight, the young Nassau was inspecting the walls of the city to prepare an assault. He was shot in the left leg just below the knee by a 6-pound cannonball. His lower leg was shattered, but due to the excellent skills of the surgeons, he survived, and his leg didn't need to be amputated. Willem Lodewijk walked with a limp for the rest of his life and needed a cane, but he mostly just remained on his horse. Coevorden easily fell back in State's hands, though the hopelessly unskilled Hohenlohe lost it again. The general launched a messy campaign, taking forts and losing them, and in the swamps of Bourtange, he was defeated again. After a few insignificant victories, the Count of Rennenberg's army of 6,000 foot and 1,200 horse laid siege on Steenwijk. Though not an important city, it was the gateway to the state of Drenthe. Steenwijk's garrison, led by Captain Johan van den Korenput, consisted of 600 soldiers and 300 trained citizens. They defied Rennenberg's order to surrender. Korenput's courage and cheerfulness sustained the population of the city during the winter siege. Anyone demanding to hand over the city before it was too late he denounced to their faces as flocks of gabbling geese, unworthy the attention of brave men. To a butcher who begged to be informed what the population were to eat when all the meat was gone, he coolly observed, "We will eat you, villain, first of all when the time comes, so go home and rest assured that you, at least, are not to die of starvation." Meanwhile, Rennenberg pressed it hard. He bombarded Steenwijk with red-hot balls, a new invention introduced 3 years earlier by Stephen Batory, King of Poland, at the siege of Danzig. Many houses were consumed, but Korenput and the citizens held firm. King Philippe had recalled Cardinal Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle and made him his minister, and together they concocted a plan to remove Willem from the equation. It was the only way to get the Netherlands back under control. The prince's power relied heavily on his personal contact with the people, so Orange should be scared into isolation. They would make every single person Willem met a potential assassin in the rebels' mind. He should be terrified to walk the streets. Once placed in a self-imposed house arrest, Willem would lose sway over the population. But better still, he had to die. After Granvelle had advised him oh so many times, King Philippe finally decided to ban the prince, declare him an outlaw, and put a price on his head. The king argued Willem of Orange was negotiating with a foreign prince. This was high treason, a criminal offense of the highest order. He should be seized, dead or alive. Governor-General Farnese wasn't sure this was a good idea. It wouldn't be smart to make Orange a martyr now. Farnese was losing the pamphlet war, which fanned the people's hatred against the Spanish. In these publications, the Dutch praised their own tolerance, freedom, and privileges while condemning the king and his advisors of extraordinary depravity. This ban might just unite the states again. Besides, Farnese was still working on a few people. King Philippe told him to sign it twice. And don't make me tell you a third time. In June 1580, Farnese reluctantly signed and published the Act of the Ban. In it, the king explained, he had been patient long enough. The Prince of Orange had seduced the people with promises and false claims. Philippe also accused Willem of a ton of things like bigamy, high treason, heresy, and hypocrisy, and Willem was a foreigner. Nobody had to listen to a foreigner. Sure, the prince had started his fight for the freedom of conscience, but now he was confused. He had unleashed a bloody war, and it was the king's duty to protect his vassals against such an evil traitor who so obviously took pleasure in the suffering of others. Philippe declared Willem a pest on the whole of Christianity and an enemy of the human race. He was no longer welcome in the Netherlands and was hereby banned. No one was allowed to communicate with him in any way or even be in his presence. They were not allowed to give him shelter, food, or drink. Anyone who did would be put to death. But everyone was allowed to attack him and damage his person and his properties. The one who killed him would get a huge reward, absolution of their and their family's sins, forgiveness for their crimes, no matter how heinous, a noble title, and 25,000 crowns in either cash or land. That's 3 million in today's dollars. Charlotte Bourbon, the prince's wife, got so scared that she checked the kitchen for poison on a very irregular basis, and the states doubled Willem's bodyguard. The Prince of Orange couldn't just let the King of Spain's accusations slide. He feared losing the support of all the states. Willem needed to defend his honor and the honor of the Dutch people. So he, Philippe van Marnix, Lord of Saint-Aldegonde, Pierre Loiselieu de Villiers, and Huguenot Philippe de Mornay, Lord of Plessis-Marly, wrote a letter to the States General, the Apologie, or Apologia. It was an exhaustive text justifying the prince's reasons for war, countering all Felipe's accusations one by one, and pointing out the king's own hypocrisy. Here are some highlights. The king's accusations didn't have an ounce of truth in them. Felipe's attack was a blatant attempt to turn everyone away from the prince by making it seem that his beef was only with Willem and not the people. Felipe claimed that Willem was a foreigner and the Dutch shouldn't listen to him. But if Willem was a foreigner, then what was Farnese? What was Felipe? Farnese was Italian and the king was a Spaniard who fracked off to Spain and never showed his face again. But the Nassau families had held properties in the Low Countries for centuries before anyone had even heard of the Habsburgers and the House of Austria. And the prince was raised here and lived here long enough for him to consider the Netherlands his home country. Willem felt that armed resistance against their lord was justified because Felipe had violated the country's inalienable rights, broken the nobility's honor code, and undermined the lord-to-subjects relation. Felipe not only failed his duties, he behaved like a tyrant, and when pointed out his failings, he dismissed it all and moderated nothing, claiming he could do so because he was the divinely appointed king. But the Netherlands was no kingdom, and Felipe wasn't its king. He was a lord who had sworn to maintain the constitutions of each and every state, and he had violated each and every oath he had taken to do so. Willem was no longer beholden to him, nor was anyone else. He was a free and independent sovereign fighting another sovereign. And Felipe couldn't judge Willem's morals, for he himself was a lying, hypocritical, incestuous adulterer who had murdered his own son Don Carlos and his wife Isabella, and now he was sending murderers Willem's way. Not that that changed anything. Felipe had been sending assassins the prince's way for years, and the king would make this murderer a nobleman? Which noble in the world would want to dine with a man who had only gotten his title and money by committing such a cowardly act? Willem would not stop seeing the people as long as God granted him mercy. He would not stop. He could not stop. Even though his son had been abducted, he'd lost 3 brothers in battle and all his properties, he swore to continue the fight to the last drop of blood and to his last cent. However, if the lords believed that things would improve because of his death or exile, he would gladly abide. But if they believed that his efforts and experience were valuable, they should unite and join together in battle with one heart and one soul to defend all the people, themselves, their wives, their children, and everyone they held dear. Je maintiendrai Nassau. Mic drop. The text was a masterpiece, though there were some exaggerations and what we now know errors. The states all rallied behind Willem and formally asked him to continue his work. They were now convinced that with banning the prince, the king had gone too far. It was time to hit the kill switch. Farnese was livid with Willem's counterclaims and he was angry at the king. Hadn't he warned him the states would close ranks? Hey presto, they closed ranks. But Felipe wasn't worried about the fallout from the prince's accusations. The lies of a heretic couldn't harm a king. Everywhere Felipe looked, he saw confusion, panic, chaos, and assassins lining up for a chance to do the Lord's work and get the reward money. He couldn't believe that people still supported this guy, but he had other things to worry about. King Sebastião I de Portugal had died 2 years ago while on an ill-advised military campaign in Morocco. He had no heir, so his 76-year-old great-uncle Henrique succeeded him. Henrique died 18 months later and had no heirs. Let the succession crisis begin. A weakened Portugal was a threat to the Spanish realm. The Ottomans could try something. The King of Spain needed the crown of Portugal. King Felipe was one of at least 5 pretenders to the throne. They were all descendants of the late King Manuel. There were daughters of younger sons, sons of even younger sons, and he himself the son of the eldest daughter of Manuel. But if Felipe wanted the crown, he would have to invade the country. And that's exactly what he did. Felipe wanted to lead the charge himself. His doctors told him no. He was 57, which was old for an Habsburger, and he had spent most his life writing at a desk. The king couldn't suddenly change lifestyles and ride a horse all day and sleep in a tent. So Felipe dusted off General Alba, who had been banished from the king's court with his son a few years ago as punishment for their reign of terror in the Netherlands. Alba, at 73, was no spring chicken either, but he took the job. On June 19, 1580, another pretender, Dom Antonio, proclaimed himself King of Portugal. He entered Lisbon, took possession of the palace, and demanded obedience from all the Portuguese. A week later, Alba crossed the border with 40,000 Spanish soldiers. Dom Antonio headed out to attack Alba, but the Duke went around him and entered Lisbon behind his back. In the meantime, the Spanish fleet seized the Portuguese fleet. The governors of Portugal were impressed and were like, yeah, Felipe's totally King of Portugal. Dom Antonio fled the country. A few months later, Felipe, dressed in full armor, entered Portugal on a horse, but he was sick from the flu and he was in mourning. His wife Anna and some of his courtiers had just died from influenza. He had to continue by carriage. 3 months later, Felipe was crowned King of Portugal. It was one of the few times in his life that he dressed like a king. Felipe hated the flamboyant regal costumes and always wore black. But just as he became the new ruler of one country, the King of Spain and Portugal lost another. On July 22, 1581, the States General assembled at The Hague and hit the kill switch. The rebel states issued the Plakkaat van Verlatingen, the Act of Abjuration. By the authority of the people of the Netherlands vested in them, they solemnly kicked Lord Felipe to the curb. They no longer recognized his authority nor his seal and would look for another ruler. The act started off by saying, "All mankind know that a prince is appointed by God to cherish his subjects as a shepherd to guard his sheep. When, therefore, the prince does not fulfill his duty as protector, when he oppresses his subjects, destroys their ancient liberties and treats them as slaves, he is to be considered not a prince, but a tyrant. As such, the estates of the land may lawfully and reasonably depose him, and elect another in his stead." This may sound familiar. 200 years later, the American Declaration of Independence started off the same way when they ditched King George. In fact, since then, many countries the world over have used the rebels' argument to proclaim independence from their sovereign. The abjuration split the country in two definitively: the independent republic in the north and the obedient states in the south. Not everyone in the north was happy with the act. A lot of government officials in Friesland, Gelderland and Overijssel resigned. The states of Gelderland only very reluctantly accepted the abjuration, and Overijssel backed out of the whole deal later. So, who did the Dutch elect as their sovereign in the king's stead? Willem had told the States General that the new sovereign had to be powerful enough to stand up to the Spanish Empire. A prince. A French prince. Hercule François, the Duke of Anjou and Alençon. At the Treaty of Bordeaux, the Duke had provisionally agreed to the lordship of the Netherlands, but with limited powers. He swore to provide a lot of money and troops. But the Dutch did not like the extravagant and arrogant Anjou at all. Holland and Zeeland weren't on board. Because, of course they weren't. They wanted Orange to be their sovereign leader. The prince turned them down many times. But now that Felipe was gone, so was Willem's position as stadtholder, the king's representative. They could make him stadtholder of Anjou, but Holland and Zeeland didn't want that. They wanted Willem, and only Willem, to be in charge. No one was installed yet. Not Willem, not Anjou, but the sovereignty of the rebel Netherlands was now basically split between the Prince of France and the Prince of Orange. Yet, the States General were in charge. Archduke Matthias of Austria was no longer needed as the Governor General. He left a few months later with a pension of 50,000 guilders a year that the Dutch never paid. The Germans were mad that they had treated a member of the imperial family so disrespectfully, but Willem didn't care. The Germans, as it turned out, despite their teeth and claws on their shields, were utterly useless. The war raged on. At the Siege of Steenwijk, winter was harsh. The red-hot balls had not proven to be very effective, so Count Rennenberg started hurling insults at the town. He wanted to know if they had eaten all the horses yet. The citizens put 60 starving horses on the walls to show they hadn't. The rebels in turn shot hollow balls containing letters into the town. Help was underway. The English commander John Norris was coming with 6,000 rebel troops. Gordonput made a big deal of the news. When 3 quail were found in the market square, he said it was an omen. The troops would arrive in 3 weeks. Sure enough, on February 22nd, 1581, at the end of the 3rd week, Norris succeeded in supplying the town. Gordonput was hailed as a prophet. Count Rennenberg abandoned the siege in despair. Antwerp, Utrecht, and various cities in Holland started issuing edicts forbidding Roman Catholic services. The edicts were nowhere near as severe as the ones used to execute thousands, but the persecuted had now become the persecutors. They felt they needed to act because some Dominican monks in Brussels were riling up the masses with their sermons. They kept talking about how relics produced miracles and showed off bits of random wood as the fragments of the cross. Bones of dogs were passed off as bones of the saints, and oil was poured into holes drilled in the heads of the statues of saints so that people believed in the miracle that they were actually sweating. To stop the outrage people felt at these devious practices, the religion was suspended until things calmed down. Meanwhile, 's-Hertogenbosch was the only Dutch-speaking town that had not entered the Union of Utrecht. They had joined the Spanish side, and now the road to the city of Breda lay wide open for the king's armies. Farnese sent in Claude de Berlaymont, the lord of Old-Tepen, yes, another Berlaymont, to take Breda. A Spanish prisoner held in the town bribed a cook to take over his watch and to let Old-Tepen in. The garrison and the citizens tried to fight back, but once the Spanish captured one of the city gates, the town was done for. The citizens surrendered under one condition: there would be no plundering or murder. But we've heard this one before. The fury of Old-Tepen lasted for days and nearly 600 citizens were killed. With Breda in his possession, Farnese was like, "Antwerp, I'm coming for you." Calvinist towns everywhere were furious at the loss of Breda, and if they hadn't already, now started kicking out Roman Catholics en masse. Meanwhile, the battle being waged in the north of the Netherlands between Count Rennenberg and the rebels had turned into guerrilla warfare. Rennenberg managed to take the Ommelanden and Drenthe but failed pretty much everywhere else. And then he died. Though Felipe had promised him the Countess of Megen's hand in marriage, he never married her. The king had deceived him. Farnese appointed Spanish military commander Francisco Verdugo as the king's new stadholder for Friesland, Groningen, Drenthe, Overijssel and Gelderland, and Verdugo picked up right where Rennenberg had left off, fighting the rebels, winning some and losing some. Down south, Farnese had laid siege on Cambrai. When Anjou arrived with an army, Farnese raised the siege and headed for Tournai. Since Anjou's cavalry had only been hired for the summer, he dismissed them. The Duke had not yet been installed as Count, Duke or Lord anywhere in the Netherlands and wasn't feeling the love. The 26-year-old went to England to court the 47-year-old Queen Elizabeth I. He believed that if he married Elizabeth, he would rule England, the Netherlands, and once his brother died, France. Trifecta. One day, while walking with the Duke, Elizabeth stopped and told the French ambassador to tell his king that Anjou would be her husband. She kissed Anjou on the lips and gave him one of her rings. Anjou gave her one of his, and the couple were now engaged. The wedding date was set for November 22nd, 1581. Farnese besieged Tournai. The Prince of Espinois wasn't home, and the princess took over for him. Philippe Christine de Lalaing resisted the royal army for 2 months, even got hurt in her arm, and lost her 1-year-old son in the attacks. But when the states could not send help, she surrendered the town. She was allowed to leave with her garrison and full honors of war. As the princess rode out of the gate, the Spanish applauded her for her bravery. Willem blamed the states and their constant bickering for the loss of Tournai. If they had installed Anjou, his army could have relieved the town. Instead, they were only thinking about their own state. In case they had forgotten, the war was waged against them all, not just the one that happened to be under attack. Instate Anjou already. Someone needs to be in charge, and it ain't me. The states promised to do better, and sent an envoy to Anjou in England to arrange the Duke's formal installation as the Lord of the Netherlands. The November wedding hadn't happened, and Anjou's England adventure was over when Elizabeth demanded her ring back. On his return to the Netherlands, she wrote a poem about his departure. "I grieve and dare not show my discontent. I love and yet am forced to seem to hate." On the Duke's arrival in the Low Countries in February 1582, Willem bowed for him to show everyone that Anjou was in charge, not him. It didn't help. Anjou, with his extravagant lifestyle, absurd manners, and his male harem, was as unpopular as ever. People did fear that France would simply incorporate the Netherlands, though the country was not as bad as Spain, certainly not worse. Willem decided to ride with the Duke through Antwerp a couple of times a week to try to raise the man's profile, but Anjou became even less popular, and Willem's popularity nosedived with it. But the Duke's birthday was coming up. Time for a party! Willem lived a pretty nomadic life, while his wife Charlotte and all his children stayed at his castle in Antwerp. But on March 18, 1582, he was home for Anjou's birthday party later that night. He had lunch with his wife, his son Maurits, his nephews Willem Lodewijk and Philippe, the Counts Hohenlohe and Laval, 2 French officers, Bonnivet and Pruneau, and several other noblemen. Afterwards, the prince led the dinner party to his apartment to show them a tapestry depicting Spanish soldiers. There, a slight young man offered Orange a petition. As Willem reached to accept it, the man drew a pistol and fired it at the prince's head. The pistol was badly designed and overloaded. It malfunctioned and exploded in the assassin's hand, taking off his thumb. Willem's hair and beard caught fire, but he stood for a moment, stunned and blinded, not realizing he was hit. He thought that something was breaking elsewhere in the house. Only when blood started seeping into his mouth and he felt his beard singeing did Willem realize he had been shot. A bullet had pierced his neck below the right ear, gone through his palate, and came out at the left jawbone, taking out 2 molars along the way. He called out, "Don't kill him! I forgive him my death!" But the 2 French officers, Bonnivet and Pruneau, who stood right next to the prince, had a lightning-fast reaction. They'd already run the assassin through with their swords. The young man was dead before he hit the floor, but the prince's bodyguards gave him a few whacks for good measure. General Hohenlohe immediately ordered the place on lockdown. Willem walked to his bed, supported by his friends. There the surgeons examined and bandaged him. The prince was certain he was dying and kept muttering about the troubles poor Anjou would now face. The doctor told him to shut up. The wound had been cauterized by the exploding gunpowder, but it could rupture again if he continued yakking, and that would kill him. Willem didn't say another word, but furiously started writing all sorts of instructions instead, including a note to Hohenlohe, half in French, half in German. The general could marry his daughter Maria if he wanted to. News about the assassination spread like wildfire through Antwerp, and everyone suspected the French, but the killer was dead, and the truth might never be known. The city quickly devolved into chaos, and it took several captains and all the city guards to restore order. Anjou was immediately, but mistakenly, informed about Willem's death. He was upset, muttering of all the problems that would now come his way. The states of Holland and Zeeland were anxious and stayed in permanent session. The magistracy of Leiden said, "With the death of His Excellency, if God should please to take him to himself, in the death of the prince, we all foresee our own death." Young Count Maurits had stayed with the body of the assassin and feared Bonnivet and Pruneau were involved in the plot to kill his father. Maybe Anjou had ordered them to kill the assassin immediately. Dead men tell no tales after all. The servants searched the man's body and gave everything they found to the 14-year-old. A bunch of trinkets and some papers. Maurits stood crying with the assassin's belongings in his hands and told the prince's servant, "Look what the scoundrel had on him." The servant assured him, "Sir, you do not need to despair. God is powerful. He has saved your father's life. But hold on to those papers, because we need to know everything about this man. Otherwise, we are doomed to land in great problems." Maurits answered, "Unfortunately, I'm very afraid that there is another rogue about who will take this from me." The teen was so distressed by now that the courtier told the guards to watch over the body in the count's place. "Sir, come with me. I will secure the papers." The courtier covered Maurits with his cloak and escorted him to a room on the top floor of the house. There they discovered that all the papers were written in Spanish. The French were cleared. But the assassin was soon identified as 20-year-old Juan de Jauregui, a Spanish clerk at the Antwerp offices of Spanish merchant Gaspar d'Agnastro. D'Agnastro had some financial troubles, and when he heard of the reward on Willem's life, saw an opportunity. He was too scared to kill the prince himself, so he asked his 20-year-old bookkeeper Antonio de Benero. He refused. Jauregui was willing to do it, though he had no experience with guns. After the clerk's corpse was paraded through Antwerp, Jauregui's body was drawn and quartered, and his body parts were displayed at Antwerp city gates. His head was placed on a stake outside the Antwerp castle. Anjou ordered to find all the supporters and accomplices of the dead assassin, but D'Agnastro got away. After bookkeeper Banero positively identified the prince's assassin as Jauregui, he was strangled and drawn and quartered on Antwerp Market Square. A Dominican priest, Antonis Timmerman, who had heard of Jauregui's plan in confession and failed to warn anyone, went out the same way. These were relatively mild executions for that time, because Willem had asked for quick deaths. The Spanish thought Willem was dead, though. Farnese found out from D'Agnastro himself that the prince had been shot in his home when he came to collect the reward. Farnese sent him back to Spain and told Felipe to treat him well. No matter the outcome, his services should be rewarded. He wrote to King Felipe that Willem was dead and how happy he was that this person got what he deserved, although considering the deeds he committed, he deserved a more painful death. God be thanked for making it happen and liberated the world from such a wicked and evil man. Farnese told Anjou to give up already and hand the country back to the king. The governor-general then told the city magistrates that they were now relieved of the tyrant and betrayer, the one responsible for all the misery and doom that they suffered. They could now return to the ever-open arms of their lawful sovereign. Willem was still alive, though, but not out of the woods yet. Two weeks after the prince had been shot, the scab on his neck fell off and blood started gushing out. They couldn't tie a bandage tightly enough around his neck to stop the bleeding without suffocating him. Willem was at death's door, and he knew it. That night he gathered all his children and told them, "Good night forever. It is now all over with me." When his Reverend de Villiers came to his bed, the prince wondered how he would answer to God for all the bloodshed he had caused. The Reverend told him that he had been fighting for a just cause, but Willem corrected him, saying, "I can only rely on grace. It is my only salvation. Grace." Fortunately, Anjou's doctor, Leonardo Botalio Vasti, figured out what to do. He had his attendants taking turns, keeping their thumbs lightly pressed against the wound, 24/7. Willem became skin and bones because he couldn't chew any meat and only sip broth. But after 17 days of the doctor's assistants pressing the wound closed, Willem was finally out of the woods. Everyone called it a miracle from God. The States General congratulated Willem and thanked the Lord for his survival. They announced a special day of prayer on May 2nd. They also appointed a permanent guard for Willem, paid for by Holland. Farnese now started hearing reports that Willem was alive. Could that be? 2 months after he was shot, Willem was able to attend church again for the special prayer day in his honor. There was such a large crowd that it was difficult for him to enter and leave the church. Unfortunately, his wife Charlotte died 3 days later from exhaustion and pneumonia, aged 35. She hadn't quite recovered from the birth of his 6th daughter in as many years. The loss of his 3rd wife caused Willem's health to plummet again, from which he barely recovered. In the meantime, Colonel van den Tijpel snatched up Aalst for the States and left the English in charge. Big mistake. In Spain, Felipe was like, "Can somebody please tell me what's going on? I got a ton of spies out there and this is a major event. Why don't I know what is happening?" Even a month after Willem had appeared in public, Farnese still couldn't tell Felipe whether Willem was dead or alive. It was relatively quiet on the battlefield, but with Anjou's return, Farnese convinced the southern states that the Italian and Spanish troops that he sent away, as he had promised, should now return. Hear that? That's the sound of a treaty breaking. Pretty soon, the foreign troops started pouring back in. The north was like facepalm. Soon the Governor-General had 60,000 well-appointed and disciplined troops, including the large reinforcements recently sent over from Spain and Italy. Half of them were stationed as garrisons in the towns. The other half were available for operations in the field. It cost him 650,000 florins a month. The forces under Anjou and the United States were also largely increased. Farnese quickly picked up several important cities along the Scheldt River and then besieged Oudenaarde. It was a bloody affair because the citizens were resisting something fierce. Farnese even entered the trenches himself to encourage the men by picking up a shovel to dig and wielding a spear during the sorties. When his troops mutinied, because they weren't paid, he stabbed one himself and had 20 others hanged. In June, while at Oudenaarde, the Governor-General finally got confirmation that Willem had survived, though it would be another 6 months before he was absolutely certain. Toward the end of the siege, Farnese barely left the scene, even taking his dinner in the field. One day he sat with his staff and nobles at an improvised table, a few drumheads draped with a tablecloth. A cannonball took off the head of a commander standing close to Farnese. A bit of his skull took out another guest's eye. 2 more guests were killed by another cannonball. A German soldier lost half his face, and yet another man had his pelvis shattered. With blood and brains all over the dinner table, the guests lost their appetite and got up to leave. Farnese quietly asked for a clean tablecloth and for the dead bodies to be removed. He insisted his guests return to the table. He told them, "If you can't stand a little blood and brains with your meal, what the frack are you doing in a war?" The heretics of Oudenaarde weren't going to get the pleasure of scaring him from his dinner. They sat back down and finished the meal unscathed. When Oudenaarde citizens heard about this, they were like, "Damn!" Impressed with the commander's determination, they surrendered, even with Anjou close to relieve the town. Oudenaarde was the birthplace of Farnese's mother, the former Governor-General Margaretha. He let the town be. Ninove was next. It wasn't an important place, but the defense here was also fierce. Because the supplies didn't arrive in time, Farnese's men were starving in their trenches. They'd already eaten all the cavalry's horses. Farnese's aide-de-camp arrived at the general's tent to get some instructions. He tied up his horse and went inside. A few minutes later he came out and found nothing but the saddle and bridle hanging from the post. He was given a horse steak as compensation. But despite this Ninove starvation, the place surrendered. Meanwhile, the Spanish and Italian troops kept pouring in. Willem's second son and heir apparent, Count Maurits, was slowly but surely adjusting to life in the Netherlands. In his demeanor, Maurits resembled his uncle Johan, who had raised him from the age of 4 and not his father. But, like his father, he was smart. He also had excellent mathematical skills and was fascinated with warfare. Maurits inhaled books about the old Roman conquest to learn about ancient strategies. The Count hadn't inherited his father's gift of the gab, though. In fact, he spoke little, wrote little, and lacked his father's subtlety, eloquence, and diplomacy. He was a straight shooter who hated flowery speeches. Some even considered him rude, and his manners unpolished. King Felipe sent spies over to check out Maurits as he grew up at his father's court. They consistently reported back that he was a calm, somber child, not particularly skilled or interested in much of anything, least of all warfare. How could they be so wrong? Perhaps Willem was worried that Maurits was a target and everything around him was kept low-key and uneventful. Perhaps the teen was simply impossible to read. Either way, Felipe was kept entirely in the dark about Maurits' true skills and ambition, which manifested very early. He aspired to be a general and couldn't wait to hit the battlefield to kick Spanish butt. In July 1582, Willem sent the University of Leiden a recommendation to enroll Maurits as a student. A week later, they enthusiastically accepted the request. I mean, they'd better. Willem founded the darn school. The prince had no money to pay for this, but since Maurits was to succeed his lord and father, the states of Holland and Zeeland each footed part of the bill, 13,000 florins a year. At the university, Maurits was taught everything military. One of his professors, Lipsius, taught him that warriors had to possess the qualities of dogs: vigilance, intelligence, strength, perseverance, and, above all, loyalty. Maurits' favorite subjects were theoretical and applied math. He excelled at calculus, arithmetic, bookkeeping, technical drawing, military architecture, and civil engineering. The Count was a skilled horseman who, from a young age, broke all his own horses, and he perfected horse driving by using math to design a new model horse bit. Maurits was also a talented dancer and a gifted lute player, and he liked long walks on the beach. Oh no, he didn't. The Count wasn't allowed anywhere near the beach for fear the Spanish ships patrolling the coast would see him and grab him. True story. Meanwhile, in Spain, Willem's firstborn, the 26-year-old Philips Willem, the Count of Buren, was languishing in his prison. The place had become a moldy dump. Any picture he hung on the wall fell off in a few days, rotted through. Guards were in his room day and night, and he hardly ever went outside anymore. He had done nothing wrong, but he was trapped. After the prince survived the assassination attempt, a Spanish captain told Philips Willem that his father was a felon who deserved to die. Insulted, the count challenged him to a duel and killed the captain with a single punch to the heart. Even though Philips Willem was a nobleman and had the chivalrous right to challenge any man to a duel, King Felipe was pretty mad and had the count arrested. Philips Willem's already limited freedom of movement became even more restricted. The count pleaded with Felipe for mercy. Consumo yo me triste vida tan miserablemente en esta fortaleza. Pardon my Spanish. But the king wouldn't budge. A year later, Philips Willem begged his governor Wildperg to present a humble plea to Felipe on his behalf. If the king could imagine his life so sad and miserable, with so few activities, he wouldn't stand for it. His health was failing, so he was now useless to his majesty. The count so wished he could do great things with his life. He assured the king that wherever he was, he would always feel loyal and connected to Felipe in his heart, no matter with how many guards his majesty surrounded him. Wildperg himself added that Willem's son's imprisonment hadn't slowed the prince down at all. If his firstborn remained in captivity, his second son, the now 15-year-old Maurits, would be his successor. As the grandson of Prince Maurice von Sachsen, the kid could count on the support of many German electors. The prince also had 9 daughters he could marry off to influential Germans. Wildperg begged the king to grant this poor, innocent man his freedom. Felipe passed the Count of Buren's request on to his secretary Idiaquez. They should talk about it in the council the next day, if there was time. It would be another 6 years before Philips Willem heard from the king's court. With pompous and elaborate ceremonies, the Duke of Anjou was finally formally accepted as the Duke of Gelderland, Lord of Friesland and Count of Flanders. In the middle of the Flanders ceremony, Francisco Basa and Nicolas de Salceda were caught trying to poison both princes. They confessed that Farnese had hired them for the double assassination. Basa killed himself in prison, but his body was hung nonetheless with a note saying that he had attempted to take the lives of Orange and Anjou at Farnese's orders. Salceda was drawn and quartered. He had been close with Lamoral von Egmont, the younger son of the late General Egmont, who was also accused of trying to kill the prince, at his own dinner table with poison kept in his ring. Meanwhile, Farnese attacked Anjou's troops at Ghent. The French fell back to the Ghent city walls where the prince and the duke stood giving orders. The governor-general lost a lot of men, and at nightfall he was forced to retreat. Lier was betrayed to the Spanish by Willem Semple, a Scottish commander. It was then plundered by Haute-Pen. Anjou's army, led by Hohenlohe and Willem Lodewijk, relieved Lochem from the Spanish siege, and then a Frisian peasant betrayed Steenwijk to the Spanish. With the loss of Steenwijk, which had been so valiantly defended by Van den Korenput, the rebels lost an important communication connection between Overijssel and Friesland. It plummeted rebel morale, and army commanders were very tempted to switch sides. Farnese was determined to break apart the damnable Union d'Utrecht. Meanwhile, King Felipe had been focused on getting his hands on the Azores, a group of islands in the Atlantic that belonged to Portugal. It was the last place for ships to victual before crossing the Atlantic to the Americas, and it was a good base to launch attacks on England and Flanders. The king sicked Admiral Álvaro de Bazán, Marqués de Santa Cruz, with a fleet over. In no time, São Miguel was in Felipe's hands. A month later, the Portuguese, English, Dutch and French then banded together against the Spanish, but at the Battle of Terceira, Santa Cruz won, and destroyed the rest of the fleet at Villafranca the next day. Now for something joyous and fun for any historian. Not. In 1582, Christmas was celebrated on the 15th of December, which was now declared the 25th of December because Pope Gregory XIII introduced a new calendar. The Gregorian calendar replaced the inaccurate Julian one, and we still use it today. As a result, any date I mention could be 10 days off, because not everyone switched at the same time. England wouldn't embrace the Gregorian calendar until 1750. Anjou was mad. He could call himself sovereign of the Netherlands, but the States General and the Prince never involved him with making both big and small decisions. He wanted a crown. It was his birthright. After asking Queen Elizabeth, his mom Catherine de' Medici, and God for advice, the Duke decided that if the States didn't want to give him his God-given authority properly, he would simply take the country, one city at a time. Anjou steadily added French garrisons in the cities of Duinkerke, Oostende, Dixmude, Dendermonde, Aalst and Vilvoorde and then captured them. Bruges smelled a rat and refused to allow the French into the town. In Antwerp, rumors started flying after a masked man with a French accent warned the watchmen that a plot was underway to take the city. Willem didn't believe the rumors, but doubled the guards at the gates, prepared the chains in the streets, and told everyone to light the city at night by putting candles in their windows, just in case. He asked Anjou about it. The Duke was all, "I swear I know nothing." Willem told him not to leave town, but Anjou was like, "I do what I want." And at 1 in the afternoon on January 17, 1583, took his 200 nobles and his entire bodyguard and left the town to join his troops on the outside. His men removed the chains stretched across the streets, supposedly to clear the way for the Duke. At the gate, one of his men broke his leg when his horse crushed him against the door. When the on-duty city guard rushed to help him, he was stabbed right in the cuirass. Anjou's man didn't have a broken leg. Jambes rompues was the code word to launch an assault. The 2 gatekeepers were killed and 3,000 musketeers and 600 horsemen rushed into Antwerp, screaming that they were taking the city for Anjou and the Roman Catholic religion. The French fury. The French soldiers swarmed into the streets of the city. They broke into stores and houses and took whatever they could find. It was lunchtime and many people were inside, but those checking out what the ruckus was about immediately came under fire. And they were like, "Oh hell no, not this again." The trumpet sounded the alarm, drums beat the attack, men grabbed their weapons and women and children climbed on the rooftops. The civil guard took up position on Main Street and started shooting the French point blank, who now ducked into the narrow side streets for cover. But that's where the fun began. From windows and rooftops, the soldiers were bombarded with stones, roof tiles, logs, furniture, and heavy chains. The whole city came together in its defense, and in half an hour, a third of the French were dead. The French obviously lacked the city-sacking experience of the Spanish. They knew one should first kill the citizens before the plundering. The survivors raced back to the gate, but troops were still entering. In the resulting chaos, soldiers were either trampled to death or beaten back by the French officers who tried to stop their cowardly retreat. Outside the city, Anjou rejoiced when he saw people falling from the walls. When he was told they were his own men, he ran. The Prince of Orange was on the opposite end of town when he heard what was happening. It was already over by the time he arrived on the ramparts, but was able to prevent a mass slaughter of captured French soldiers. Over 1,500 troops and 200 nobles died. Only a few Frenchmen escaped. The rest were taken prisoner. Anjou fled toward Dendermonde, but the Mechelen citizens had breached the dike to stop him, and 1,000 men drowned in the rushing water. The Duke made camp in Berchem, where he started writing furious letters to everyone. Anjou was angry and embarrassed. After floating one after another ridiculous explanation for what had happened, he finally settled on it had all been an accident. His soldiers had gotten into an altercation with the guards at the gate and everyone had just joined in. Antwerp was like an accident. Had he also accidentally taken over the other towns in Flanders? Farnese got the popcorn. Everyone was more than done with the French adventure. Willem's popularity tanked as he still tried to keep Anjou in play. He had to. He had given the Duke an earful, but dropping Anjou meant the country risked a political meltdown with the French and the English. Even after Willem found out that the Duke was secretly talking to Farnese's agents about a deal, he stuck by him. Anjou had offered the Governor-General his captured cities in exchange for safe passage out of the country and some border towns. Farnese was like, that's cute. Mi scusi while I go besiege Eindhoven. Ciao. The French fury created a lot of confusion among the states. Everyone was freaking out. What should they do? Willem, tell us! Willem didn't really want to. His pro-French course and his hope for religious peace were shot and he was done. But he finally told the States General that they had 3 crappy choices. Make peace with Felipe, reconcile with Anjou, or use all their God-given strength to fight Spain on their own. Peace with Felipe was impossible. The man could not be trusted. Case in point, Farnese had already broken his oath to the southern states by bringing the Spanish troops back in. Peace with Spain would also anger the French. Keep in mind that Anjou could become King of France one day. Reconciling with Anjou was tricky. The Duke had done them wrong, but a scorned Anjou could do serious damage. The Duke still held many cities that he could easily turn over to Spain just to spite the Dutch. And keep in mind that Anjou could become King of France one day. Willem preferred to continue the fight on their own with the Lord's help. But let's be real, the states were not unified. They were a bunch of jealous, bickering, lazy cheapskates. They couldn't raise armies, they couldn't even get the cities to accept the prince's garrisons to protect them. And of course Anjou could become King of France one day, waltz right in, and annex the country to France. The council members started bickering. Willem simply said, "If you want the Spaniard, then kill me," and walked out of the hall. The states agreed to reopen negotiations with Anjou. They gave him back his captured soldiers, goods and money, but he had to promise not to take up arms against anyone but the enemy. In May 1583, the Duke and the states made a provisional agreement. The definitive one took a lot longer to put together. People couldn't just forgive and forget. And Holland and Zeeland weren't on board at all. They still wanted Willem to be their count and continued their negotiations with him to get it done. Anjou, as per the new agreement, sent the Marshal of France to relieve the city of Eindhoven, but the starving citizens had eaten all the cats, dogs and horses. They had already accepted favorable terms to surrender to the Spanish. Everyone was allowed to leave the town with their goods. The city had become useless and was dismantled. That same month, Willem, lonely and in need of a mother for his many children, married his fourth wife, the 27-year-old Louise de Coligny. Widowed at 19, she had been very isolated and was excited to marry the 50-year-old Willem, despite his age and despite the fact that he was dirt poor at this point. But she was a French woman. Dude, read the room. Louise's life was hard in Antwerp. The citizens had their fill of the French. They would stop her carriage in the street, yelling at her to remember the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. As if she could forget. She'd lost her husband Charles de Téligny and her father, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, that day. Maybe you thought her name sounded familiar. But she would leave the town soon. After Farnese's army took Steenbergen in Brabant, the Governor-General chased Anjou out of Dunkirk. In June 1583, the Duke left for Paris without a final agreement regarding the lordship of the Netherlands in place. On July 22nd, Farnese moved on Antwerp. Willem was forced to flee to Middelburg in Zeeland with the government. In September, Colonel Taxis surprised the city of Zutphen. Little Birdie had told him where the weak spot in the defenses was. That little birdie turned out to be Willem's brother-in-law, Count Willem van den Berg. He had taken over the rebel stadholder of Gelderland from Willem's brother Johan of Nassau. Johan had business to attend to at home. Van den Berg handed the city and the entire state over to the Spanish in exchange for the king's stadholderate, a pardon and friendship of the king. 2 months later, Van den Berg was arrested and imprisoned in Holland, though he was eventually freed again. He had to promise to stay out of the war. Farnese was on a roll and snatched up the towns Anjou had seized. With Dunkirk and Newport in Spanish hands, the rebellion in the south was doomed. The Governor-General then laid siege on Ghent, captured Sas van Ghent, and bought Aalst from the English. Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot. Holland told Willem that Anjou was officially cancelled. They called him over to install him as the Count of Holland. With Anjou gone, Willem finally agreed. The states of Holland and Zeeland made a treaty with Willem that was acceptable to him. It did not increase his powers, it reduced them. Louise, 7 months pregnant, joined him on this uncomfortable journey to their new residence in Delft. Holland was a lot more receptive to Louise, and Holland was rich. Like filthy, rotten, stinking rich. What a difference with the now impoverished Antwerp, and Willem was still very popular up north. A month later, Louise gave birth to Hendrik Frederik. Yay! Another son! So, Willem had 13 kids now. 9 girls, 3 boys, and 1 bastard son. And yes, it was Hendrik Frederik at first. He changed his name to Frederik Hendrik after a certain event that we'll get to in part 3 of the series. But no history book, unless they are contemporary, refer to him that way, so to avoid confusion, I'll call him Frederik Hendrik from now on. The eldest son of the Duke of Aarschot, the Protestant Charles de Croix, Prince of Chimay, was the governor of Bruges. He didn't like Orange at all. He thought he was a traitor and vowed to remove both prince's troops. When he was elected Stadtholder of Flanders, he was like, "Hey, Farnese, what are you offering for this state?" Besieged Ghent joined the negotiations. Holland, Antwerp and the prince threw everything but the kitchen sink at Ghent to stop their negotiations with Farnese. It worked. The Governor-General would have to take the city by force, and he certainly intended to. Other cities followed Ghent's lead and stopped talking to Farnese, but in the meantime, Chimay handed Bruges to the Spanish in May 1584. After a long siege, Ypres fell into Spanish hands. The new bishop immediately cleansed the town and kicked out all the Protestants. Long-buried heretics were publicly hanged in their coffins. Meanwhile, assassins kept coming Willem's way. Pedro d'Ordoño had been executed in Antwerp for plotting to kill the prince. He confessed that he had come from Spain just to kill Willem and that the Spanish government was aware of his plans. Hans Hanszoon, a Flushing merchant, was executed for trying to blow up the prince with gunpowder, which he put both under Willem's house and under his seat in church. About the same time, Farnese promised freedom to Le Goff, a French officer captured by the Spanish, if he killed the prince. Le Goff said, "Easy peasy lemon squeezy, just poison a plate of eels, Willem's favorite." The man was released and immediately ran to Willem to tell him the whole thing. He figured that if the Spanish felt they didn't need to keep their word to heretics, he didn't need to keep his word to murderers. That's 6 attempts in 2 years that we know of. Willem kept begging city councils and sheriffs of dozens of towns to be on the lookout for suspicious individuals, like new inhabitants, and to kick them out. They could be assassins. The old Treaty of Bordeaux the states had concluded with Anjou was no longer working. They needed a new one. A few months later, Anjou finally agreed to a new set of rules. The States General were desperate. They granted him more powers, and if he died without heirs, the Netherlands would be annexed to France according to the ancient rights and privileges. Then the Duke became ill. On June 10, 1584, Anjou died a horribly painful death, sweating blood from every pore. He was 29. There were persistent rumors he was poisoned. Some even thought Willem was behind it all. It was either malaria or tuberculosis. So, what could the rebels do now? The States General basically said that the draft of the treaty with Anjou was a valid agreement and the Netherlands now belonged to the French king. And the French king was like, "No way, I ain't taking no title if it doesn't have the powers to go with it." Back to the drawing board, boys. Maybe they should talk to Felipe? But Willem was like, "Don't even." So the States General remained sovereign until they got themselves a new one. Meanwhile, Willem ordered General Hohenlohe to get Zutphenberg that his brother-in-law had handed over to the Spanish last year. On July 1st, 1584, the States of Holland told Willem they were ready to install him as their count. 2 days later, on July 3rd, Antwerp came under siege from the Spanish. On Sunday morning, July 8, 1584, while Willem was still in bed, he read about Anjou's death in the dispatches freshly delivered from France. He asked for its messenger to come and tell him more. It was François Guillon, a Frenchman from Besançon. The prince had already heard about him a few months earlier. The 27-year-old man was a refugee, a pious, psalm-singing, Bible-carrying, church-going Calvinist whose father had been murdered for being a Protestant. The man wasn't remarkable or important, but Guillon had gotten hold of models of the seals of the Royal General Peter Ernst von Mansfeld and could forge the commander's signature. Willem and his advisors thought Anjou could use him, so they had sent Guillon to France to offer his services to the Duke. By the time Guillon got to France, he found out that Anjou had died. He offered to deliver the sad tidings of the Duke's demise to the prince in person. Guillon was actually very eager to meet Willem face to face, because he was planning to kill him. François Guillon was in fact Balthazar Gérard, a devoted Roman Catholic with a deep hatred for Protestants. Both his parents were alive and well in Vuillafans, and he'd been plotting to kill the prince for years. The moment he heard that King Felipe wanted the prince dead, he saw it as his life's mission to do it. The reward wouldn't hurt either. He had joined the Spanish army as a clerk, hoping the battlefield would get him closer to the prince. It hadn't. When he found out that Gaudigi's attempt had failed, he took it as a sign. He snatched the models of Mansfeld's seal and deserted. He figured the models would get him in the door at Willem's court. And they had. At this very moment, 4 other people were lurking in Delft plotting to kill Willem, each unaware of the other's existence. That Sunday morning, Gerard couldn't believe his luck when he unexpectedly found himself talking extensively with Willem about Anjou's death, but he had no weapons on him and no escape plan. When Gerard was invited to the court again for another job, he scoped out the house and courtyard for the best way to make his escape in the future. He started talking to various members of the court to get acquainted with them. When a halberdier told him he had no business being at the house, Gerard complained that he wanted to go to church, but he didn't have proper shoes and socks. Willem had his secretary give the poor man a bit of cash to get some, and he was sent away. Gerard used some of this money to buy a pistol from a French soldier later that day, and he bought another from one of the prince's bodyguards. On July 10, 1584, Gerard returned to the Prinsenhof and walked right past the guards, who remembered him. In the hallway, he asked Willem for a passport. The prince told him to come see him after lunch. Louise didn't like the look on Gerard's face and warned her husband. Willem assured her that the man was harmless. Gerard went to his room at the Diamond Ring, loaded one pistol with 2 bullets, the other with 3. He concealed the weapons under his cloak and returned to the prince's court. A little after 1:30 in the afternoon on July 10, 1584, Willem left the dining room with his sister and his wife. He talked a bit with English Colonel Thomas Morgan and Welsh Captain Roger Williams, and then turned around to go up the stairs. Gerard jumped out, leveled a pistol with the 3 bullets at Willem's chest, and fired. One bullet went right through the prince and through his coat, and allegedly hit the wall behind him. Stablemaster Jacques de Malderay caught Willem as he collapsed and put him in his stunned sister's lap as she sat down on the stairs. Louise knelt beside her husband and held his hand. Malderay reported the prince's last words. Mon Dieu, ayez pitié de mon âme. Mon Dieu, ayez pitié de ce pauvre peuple. My God, have pity on my soul. My God, have pity on these poor people. When Katharina asked her brother in German whether he commended his soul to Christ, the prince answered in German, "Ja, ja." But they were more like breaths. His left lung was filling with blood. They carried him to the dining room couch where he breathed his last moments later. The Prince of Orange died. He was 51 years old. It was the first time in history that a politician was assassinated with a firearm. Gerard hightailed it out of there. He fled through a side door and headed for the ramparts. Captain Williams and a halberdier were in hot pursuit. Gerard planned to jump into a moat and swim to his horse waiting on the other side. He had an inflated pig's bladder tied around his waist to keep him afloat, but he tripped over a trash heap. Williams and the halberdier caught him, tied him up, and dragged him back to the house. Gerard asked, "Il est mort?" The men said no. Gerard was quite upset that he had failed his mission. He was questioned, and he gave an elaborate statement about his act. He had acted alone. He had done it because the prince had broken the pacification of Ghent, and he would do it again if he had to. He was no traitor, because he had obeyed the orders of his lord and master, the King of Spain. He hoped that the subjects would once again return to their natural sovereign. The magistrates feared that he was actually working for some French people, but apart from mentioning Farnese, Balthazar gave him nothing. They decided to torture him in the most horrible ways, both day and night. Google it. He never said a word, never screamed in pain, never cried, never withdrew from his torturer, and never said another name. René Moerwit, one of the prince's bodyguards who had sold a gun to Gerard, found out that it was his gun that killed Willem. He stabbed himself in the stomach with his sword and died soon after. Balthazar Gerard was executed 4 days after murdering Willem. They first smashed the murder weapon into pieces. A piece of it hit the executioner's ear, causing everyone, including Gerard, to laugh. They burnt off Balthazar's murderer's right hand and 6 other parts of his body down to the bone. They cut off his genitals, cut open his stomach, took his still beating heart and threw it in his face. He died. He hadn't given a peep, though he appeared to be praying the whole time. He was then drawn and quartered, and they cut off his head. The 4 ripped-off body parts were displayed at 4 different gates of the city. His head was put on a stake on a school tower behind the Prinsenhof. Gerard's family got all the rewards and titles, but the king was broke, so instead of money, they got land. In fact, they got Willem's land in France. Gerard was a hero in his hometown. There were attempts to sanctify him, but he never became a saint. I need to set something straight because I know this is a hotly debated thing as of late. Willem's final words are controversial. Some claim today, without evidence, that he was shot through the heart and was dead in an instant, and that his final words were all just propaganda. Myth forming isn't uncommon in these situations, but a variety of eyewitnesses said that Willem spoke, even though not everyone could hear the actual words. Were they all in on this conspiracy? And the doctors who did the autopsy as well? Because the autopsy report clearly stated that the bullets had hit the stomach, the midriff, and the left lung. His right lung and heart were undamaged. Furthermore, a few hours later, his words were written down, and the wording even corrected in the margin of the minutes of the States of Holland meeting. Why bother correcting the wording if it's fake news? And Nassau family members paraphrased his final words in private letters to each other. Why would they, if it was just a myth? But let me know what you think in the comments. Willem, the Prince of Orange, the Count of Nassau, Katzelbogen, Vianden, Dietz, Buren, Lingen and Leerdam, Marquis of Vere and Bergen-op-Zoom, Burgrave of Antwerp and Besançon, Baron of Breda, Grimbergen, Arles, Nozeroy, IJsselstein, Diest and Cuijk, Lord of Chastel-Bellon, was dead. King Felipe was thrilled and felt blessed. The war was over. The head of the snake was cut off, and the body would soon perish. The Dutch, now paralyzed and in shock, would beg for his mercy and return to him, their lawful lord and the mighty Spanish Empire. Willem had been murdered at about 1:30 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the pensionary of Rotterdam, arrived in Delft and found it in utter chaos. When Oldenbarnevelt finally managed to get someone to tell him what had happened, he knew that he had to act fast. The pensionary took off for the Delft City Hall and got the few officials gathered there to call together the entire Council of Holland. With an impressive, stately, and imposing appearance, Oldenbarnevelt was no man to be trifled with. Under his guidance, they started writing letters to all the rebel cities and states to not ever give up the fight. They passed a resolution to maintain the good cause with God's help to the uttermost without sparing blood or gold. They also begged military and naval commanders to bear themselves manfully and valiantly without faltering in the least on account of the great misfortune which had occurred, or allowing themselves to be seduced by anyone from the Union of Utrecht. They were too late to prevent rebel General Hohenlohe from abandoning the siege of Zutphen. He had been the last one to ever receive orders from Willem. The states weren't the only ones writing letters. Farnese did as well. The Governor General offered the cities easy terms of surrender, leaving the issue of religion open. The city of Dordrecht was the first to take measures against this. Any man who brought a letter from the enemy to a private person should be forthwith hanged. Many other cities used town criers to proclaim that they would continue their fight. We have to wonder, had King Felipe ever heard about Johan van Oldenbarnevelt? A brilliant lawyer who marched on Haarlem, helped with the relief of Leiden, worked on the Union of Utrecht and the Act of Abjuration? Did the king have any clue that by murdering Maurits's father, he had fanned the flame of intense hatred for him in this budding military genius? Already 2 days after his father's murder, Maurits wrote the besieged city of Ghent that he was deeply saddened by his father's death. Considering his last words were, "My God, take care of my soul, my God, take care of your people," the Count hoped that the merciful God had heard his father's prayers and that he would take the country under his holy care and protection. As their good friend, the young man assured the magistrates, he was more than ever determined and resolved to finish the righteous battle against the tyranny of the Spaniards and their supporters, and to maintain their Protestant religion. Brace yourselves, good people. Brace yourselves.